Hello, everybody. Welcome to the nation's capital and to today's meeting of the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. Let me first say that our Bureau Chief, Lisa Folks, wanted to be here today but was called away, and she wanted you all to know that she's well aware of the work that you've done. She appreciates it and wanted to give you all a big hand. So I'll do that on her behalf. And I'll also do it on my behalf, so thank you, and I'll have a chance to do that again later. Today, we're going to be hearing from two of the working groups that have reports for you to consider, and we'll vote on those today. It's Working Group 1, the Transition to NG911 Working Group, and Working Group 2, the Reimagining Alerting, Emergency Alerting Working Group. So we'll get presentations from those two working groups, and then we'll have a vote. And then we'll also get a status report from Working Group 3, which is now working on the 5G technologies. So that's the agenda for today. And with that, I think I'll just turn it over to our chair, Brian King.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, fellow council members in the room. We've got, I think what I'll quickly do is go through a roll call here because, as Jeff said, we've got a couple of things we need to vote on today, and I want to make sure that we have quorum and appreciate the folks who are filling in for those of us in the council who would rather start our vacation a little bit earlier for next week. So, but here we are on a Friday before 4th of July, so I appreciate folks showing up in person and on the phone. So we'll just quickly go around the room. If we can start with you, Jeff and Suzanne.
Suzanne.
Yeah.
Suzanne Cameron, FCC.
Jeff Goldthorpe, FCC.
Good afternoon. Dorothy Spears-Dean, representing the National Association of State 911 Administrators.
Dan Henry, representing the National Emergency Number Association.
Budge Courier with the California Governor's Office of Emergency Service.
Francisco Sanchez, Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management.
Susan Miller with ADIS.
Farouk Katibi, Qualcomm.
Lee Thibodeau from Insight.
Okay, and then hoping we've got Mary Boyd out there on the phone.
Yes, sir, I am. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Charlotte Field, are you out there from Charter?
Yes, I
am. Gary Smith from Cherry Creek Radio, are you out there? Okay, no Gary. Anyone else join us by the phone today?
Tim Walden, CenturyLink.
Thank you, Tim.
Don Brittingham, Verizon.
Kevin Gage, OneData.
Ed Zarnicki, Monroe Electronics.
Shirley Bloomfield, NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association.
Anyone else on the mute key? Okay, I think we have quorum to move on. Before we start, and I know Gary didn't announce himself, but I did want to let the council members know that due to his recent retirement, Gary Smith, this will be his last CSRIC, so just want to pass that message on. Gary's been an active member of the council for CSRIC 5 and CSRIC 6, and has also served on working groups in CSRIC 3 and CSRIC 4. And I want to personally thank him for his outstanding service to CSRIC and to the FCC. Gary's worked as a chief radio engineer for the past 35 years in Salt Lake City and southern Utah, as well as Phoenix. And Gary recently retired as chief engineer at Cherry Creek Radio. And throughout his career, he's been involved in the design and manufacture of broadcast equipment, and with a particular passion towards emergency alerting and overall public safety. So please join me, even though he's not on the phone, in congratulating Gary on his retirement and thanking him for his contributions to this council. Thank you, Gary. So with that, we'll start with Working Group 1. I guess we'll reach out to you, Mary. Do you want to introduce the folks that will be presenting in the room today?
Yes, sir, and thank you for accommodating my remote participation. My apologies for not being able to join you there in D.C. I'm going to share the presentation today with both Budge Courier, California 911 Program, and Dorothy Spears Dean from the Commonwealth of Virginia. They both have co-chaired Task 1 and Task 2 and will offer those reports. If I could, Mr. Chairman, if Jeff, if you could drive the presentation for me for just a second, and there is some delay between voice and video, just so you know. The first slide is our objective, and I'd just like to recap Working Group 1's objective is to improve both legacy 911 and NG 911 systems to include recommending ways in which the Commission could further the transition to NG 911 and enhance the reliability and effectiveness through routing redundancy and maintenance, and more importantly, to mitigate against the threat of outages in both legacy 911 and NG 911. If we could, just a quick review of the participants in this working group. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to do just a quick sync with you. Could you confirm if we were on that slide, please?
Yeah, we just resolved our technical issue in the room here, Mary. So we're on your second slide now, which is your working group members.
All right, thank you, sir. I'd just like to, recognize all the individuals that have worked both on Task 1 and Task 2. And in addition to that, we have sought out subject matter experts that are brought in by invitation. Those are reflected on the membership slide. And I just want to say a big thank you to all those individuals who have worked so hard. Today is a very big day for Working Group 1. If we'll go to the next slide, please. It recaps really our Task 1 objectives for you, in which you're going to hear our report today. The final report comes to you with recommendations for 911 system reliability and resiliency. And specifically, our charter included the review of existing best practices, guidance regarding best practices. You're going to hear an update on that in our report. One element of our charter was to identify the risk associated with transitioning 911 systems that could result in disruption. That's number 3 on the slide. That element took a lot of effort. You'll see in our extensive report there is a lot of discussion about the transition elements and the network elements. Number 4, we were asked to make recommendations that would protect the NG 911 networks, including best practices and standards development. And deliverable number 5 and 6, on the next slide, please, where we were to study very specific actions that originating service providers or system service providers that are involved in the 911 call chain that could do to detect and deter outages prior, to the delivery of the 911 call into the ESI Net Gateway. Extensive work was done on this element as well. And then the final recommendation you're going to hear from Budge in our report is regarding what we could do to encourage the private sector to look, at minimizing to actually detect and deter to minimize outages, and really to focus on tools that might be commercially available and not burdensome to implement that could aid in that. So at this point, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask Budge Courier if he could take Task 1. He co-led this with Walt Magnuson and a team of people that worked on this report. I am honored to be able to turn this over to Budge and let him do the readout on our final report for Task 1.
Thank you, Mary.
All right, so if you'll go to the, I guess there's a lag in the microphone there. All right. So on this slide, what you see is basically a high-level summary of what's in the report. The report is roughly 100 pages in length. And it starts with an executive summary, and we purposely wrote the executive summary to include all of the important data. So it could be just that, something that if you're only going to read 3 or 4 pages, we included all the recommendations and all the high-level findings from the report in that executive summary. Throughout the report, we clearly define NextGen 911 roles. There's a huge part of the report that's dedicated to the technical framework, and we define the functional elements and the interfaces and points of interconnect throughout the NG 911 space. This took quite a bit of effort, as you know, because we have to accommodate sort of these transitional states that are going to exist. So there's a number of figures and diagrams throughout the document that identify those demarc points. And it's at those demarc points that decisions need to be made between whichever service provider is handling that demarc. In California's case, we've chosen a particular implementation to address those demarcs, but it may be done differently in Virginia or North Dakota or somewhere else in the country, and we understand that. So we've written the document purposefully so that multiple state entities and service providers can use the document as a tool and a guide. We've analyzed those various demarc points throughout the document and talked through them in quite a bit of detail. Again, trying very hard not to define a specific solution, but rather provide a framework that could be applied to multiple solutions, since we know that different states and entities are approaching this differently. We have a section that includes the recommendations related to enhancing transition from legacy to NextGen 911 in the report as well. And we presented some research findings on the tools that are currently available out there for outage reporting and those capabilities that already exist, either with the originating service providers or some of the other providers that are working in this space. So all of that is contained kind of in an informative fashion in the middle part of the document. So if you go to the next slide. We also, this slide focuses on the recommendations that we have in the report. There are numerous pages that outline what these recommendations are in detail. I'll provide a real high-level summary right now. So service providers, we're encouraging them to ensure project management and network operations review the report. Originally, I had written this bullet as actually read the report, and Mary cleaned it up a little bit for me. But really, that's the intent. The intent is that folks would actually read the report. There's a lot of good information in there. We're also looking that there needs to be a way to identify within the networks any service impacting events that could cause a loss of service. And so we want originating service providers, NextGen 911 providers, and existing 911 providers have to work together to identify those points in the network, and we understand that. So service providers should also ensure that product management teams and those that have oversight of the networks have visibility into their networks to be able to detect and monitor what's happening in the network, what happens at the transitional points. When you come to a demarc and you're going to handle that call flow off to the next person in the chain, you have to clearly define what that looks like, and you have to be able to hand that call off and have a metric in place where you can track that has happened. And so that we talk about that in the report. And then the other important recommendation we have in there is that service providers should be really taking a close look to make sure that they understand how to deter threats in the network, how to detect threats in the network, and what to do, when those things happen. Obviously, a big part of this, I've run a 911 program for a rather large state, so notification of those events is very important for us as we manage those networks. And so working together with the service providers to make sure that those notifications happen and are sent to those that are managing the networks is really important. On the next slide, please. So continuing on with some more additional recommendations. The service providers and other stakeholders really need to work together on the system monitoring piece. And some of this is going to be done through contract language, we know. Other things need to happen just through common best practices of how you're going to manage the network. And so there's going to need to be a lot of collaboration between the stakeholders. And stakeholders is really everyone from those managing the 911 system and having oversight of the 911 system to the service providers all the way back to the originating service providers that are delivering 911 calls into that network. And the information needs to be made available to all those stakeholders when needed. And we know that there's some challenges there in proprietary solutions that may be in place, and so that's not the intent. But the intent is to figure out a way to be able to share the health of the network in a way that doesn't compromise any industry, trade-related issues, but yet provides the visibility in the network to make sure that it's healthy and survivable and is doing routing 911 calls the way that it's supposed to. In Section 12, we have an analysis of the network monitoring tools that are available. We did some research on what tools are available, and we provide a summary there. And then we have a recommendation. While we were not charged specifically with looking at cybersecurity, that wasn't anything we were asked to do. We understand the importance of it, and we think that that's an important consideration in this space. And we think that future CSRIC should take a really in-depth look at cybersecurity and its impact. Again, that was beyond the scope of our charter, but it consistently came up as a theme, and so that would be one of our recommendations to the Commission. All right, the next slide. The next step for us, we have received approval from the Commission to actually develop best practices and extend our time frame through next spring to get that done. Our goal is to have it done by December, and Mary is already starting to drive that task process. We've already had our first meetings on that. The rest of the bullets on this slide are just the additional assistance that we need as we move forward. So we're going to be continuing to review the existing best practices, and the idea there will be to go through those that exist and see which ones might need to be modified to accommodate this newer technology that's encompassed within Next Gen 911, and then to identify any gaps that may exist so that best practices can be developed to fill in those gaps. And then, of course, we'll be coming back and reporting those out to the Commission and what our findings are. And we're talking through some of the mechanics of what that looks like in the report when we issue version 2, because we really think it should probably just be incorporated into like a version 2 of the report where we add this additional information in there. And again, our goal is to have that completed by December of 2018. All right, next slide.
So can I just clarify that last bullet there? It says completed by spring of 2019 with a goal of 2018. Can you just clarify that?
Yeah, so we've been given through the spring of 2019 to get this done, but we want to get done ahead of schedule. Okay. Is essentially what that bullet is saying.
Perfect.
And again, that's thank you very much, Mary.
My pleasure. Thank you, Budge.
Yep.
So, Mr. Chairman, I believe this actually concludes the overview of the final report for Task 1. Procedurally, would you like to call for acceptance or approval of our recommendations in this report?
Yeah, absolutely, Mary. I think, before we move on with Dorothy's presentation, I'd like to call for a vote to, accept these recommendations. We'll start within the room. So all those in favor in the room, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, and on the phone, please.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, that was more than 12. That's good. Okay, so that's passed. So thank you very, very much. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, at this point, Working Group 1 has an update on the Task 2 assignments. If we could go to the next slide, and I'll turn this over to Dorothy Spears-Dean for the update. She co-leads this with Jim Gerke from the Texas 911 Alliance, and Jim is on the phone as well. Ms. Dorothy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. So task 2, the report that we're working on is to advise the FCC on small carrier issues related to NG 911 implementation, including recommendations on how the FCC could address these issues. Our work group's goal in this report is to build on a review of today's legacy environment and address service providers' interconnection with both transitionary and end-state NG 911 systems, call and data-related matters, security, and regulatory and policy issues. As NG 911 stakeholders continue our discussion on NG 911 transitional efforts, we continue to expand that dialogue concerning the ingress of additional groups into the NG 911 ecosystem. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the next slide, and I'll go ahead and review the small carrier NG 911 transition considerations. The work group considered 4 types of small carriers: wireless carriers, local exchange companies that provide wired service, television cable operators, and the last group is internet data service providers. The next 2 bullets talk about economic disadvantages and barriers to implementation. In our subsequent report at the September meeting, we will provide more information related to those 2 points. But I did want to mention during today's meeting that we do address funding in this report, as well as additional items such as transitional timelines, devices, roaming implications, capacity issues during major emergencies, and staff preparedness. Similarly to the report that Budge just discussed, this report also has an entire section that focuses on security. In this report, the identification of cybersecurity issues and documentations of related cybersecurity practices for the NG 911 ecosystems as it pertains to small carriers is the scope. Much of the proposed cybersecurity strategy that has been proposed for inclusion in our report is based on NIST cybersecurity framework, the NICE framework for cybersecurity education, and the ongoing work of CSRIC, as well as other authorities, including the Department of Homeland Security. Next slide, please. So our working group right now is meeting weekly. Our shift has gone from developing content to editing. This is to ensure that we have a draft report ready for the CSRIC to consider in the August timeframe and for a vote to take place at the September meeting. I think I've covered everything, hopefully I've covered everything related to what we wanted to accomplish today related to the Task 2 update. But as Mary said, Jim is also participating on the bridge. So Jim, if I left anything off that you wanted to see included, please jump in.
Okay, Dorothy, thank you.
Go ahead, Mary.
Mr. Chairman, I think I just want to wrap up our presentation with just our schedule going forward. If we go to the next slide, please. I'm a little delayed, so if somebody could tell me if we have the project schedule slide up.
Yeah, we have Working Group 1 project schedule right now.
Thank you, sir. Big accomplishment today. As indicated on this slide, we were seeking support for our final report on Task 1. As Dorothy indicated, Task 2 has worked parallel for many, many months on their deliverables. There is a goal to have it wrapped up by early August and then submitted to the Commission for our September council meeting. And then finally, the work on the best practices, as we've discussed, we'll actually hope to have those completed by December, but spring of 2019 at the latest. Our next steps on the next slide, please. We will continue our work drafting and doing extensive review on the best practices, looking at the gap analysis as Budget discussed. There's quite a bit of work there, so we are getting started on it, and we will move forward with those deliverables. We have, as you can tell from our reports, weekly engagements with the various teams on the deliverables. those will continue, and then Mr. Chairman will give updates to your steering committee on a regular basis. That concludes our report for Working Group 1. Excuse me. Once again, I want to thank all of the volunteers, subject matter experts, and a little shout out to Tom Breen with Comtech for his work in publishing the report. He's been our scribe on all that work for Task 1. That is a very difficult job, and I want to just acknowledge his hard work on it. And Mr. Chairman, can I answer any questions, or Dorothy or Budge answer questions from the council?
Yeah, so if there's, you guys know the drill in the room, all few of us here, but you know, if they have questions for the folks there, but great presentations, and great to see those recommendations getting approved. Or if there's questions out there on the phone. Okay, all very straightforward. So thank you, Mary, thank you, Budge and Dorothy. And let's move on to Working Group 2 now, and Farouk.
Thanks, Brian. If it's okay, I'll use the podium. It kind of reminds me of when I was a professor at university. It makes me feel good. And it gives you a break on your tongue. Oh, yeah. So this is the report of Working Group 2 on comprehensive reimagining of emergency services. Next, right? Oh.
You can present Mary's slides again.
I will not know
See if you
where
were
to
paying
start. Thank you. So the objective of Working Group 2, there are two parts to Working Group 2. One was on reimagining of emergency services, and the second part is on security aspects of emergency services. And the report that we have completed is on the first part, and the second part will be done by December of this year. So I have a little bit of good news for the group. So this slide shows the Working Group 2 members, and I also want to show the Working Group 2 alternate members. And I really have to tell you that, you know, we have a great group of people, and they've been really, really collaborative and working very closely with each other. And without their help, obviously, we would not have a report going on. So thanks. I really want to thank all the Working Group 2 members. So what's the background? The background is that, well, obviously, it's critical to have the relevant information in a timely fashion to the targeted individual. This becomes more and more important as you know, in recent times. There are a number of techniques to disseminate critical emergency alert, and our group, we have been evaluating some of these techniques, and also we have looked at what are the needs, what are the potential improvements we can provide, and try to see what is it that we need to do, and that as a result of those, we created some recommendations. So, you know, if we look at the big picture of the public alerting and warning system, there are two, you know, if you will, access to it. The first one is some of the facets. It starts from how the alert is triggered, and then all the way to how the alert is presented to the end user and how the alerts are integrated. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that what are the contexts of this alerting system? And often people think about the technology, and technology is only one element of it. There are a lot of, you know, procedural, regulatory, policy, et cetera, that play an important role on the alerting system. So this big picture that shows all the different elements, I find it very important. But for the purpose of the work that we have done in Working Group 2, we really focus on the last three columns, if you will, with an overview of all the columns, but the last three columns from where how the alert is disseminated, how it's presented, and how alerts are combined together. So that was the main focus of our working group. So how did we do that? Our approach was pretty straightforward. First, we studied all the dissemination technologies available, and then we said, okay, let's take a look at some use cases. What are the scenarios that emergency alert would be useful? And we show a little picture there, and if you can read it, your eyes are much better than me. That's an eye chart. But this just shows a sample of a use case where we kind of describe how an emergency alert would be created, on how do we make sure that happens. When that happens, the right people, the right place, they get the right information. So based on that analysis, then we recommended some recommendations to this group. So there are three types of recommendations that we have provided. One, some are short-term, and by short-term, we mean less than 5 years. And in some of the telecom and others, 5 years is definitely, I mean, by the time you plan things, it's very quickly. And then there are some longer terms recommendations that we have, that those are like 5 to 10 years, kind of aspirational, so that we know that that's the direction that we want to go, so that we have that in the back of our mind as we develop 5G, 6G, and so forth. Where do we want to go? So those are recommendations kind of like a longer term, so that we have that in the back of our mind. Then we have some evolutionary recommendations. Those are recommendations that we want to make sure that, some of them are already possible, but some of them needs to be evolved and improved on. So we didn't want to lose track of those. So really wanted to have a holistic view of what is it that we want to do and where we want to go and what is the progress going forward. And there's a note there that not all recommendations apply to all technologies. So for example, we have wireless emergency alert. They can provide some features. We have EAS and so forth. We have ATSC 3.0. So some of these recommendations may apply to some technology, but not the others, obviously, because they have characteristics that are different from each other. So we wanted to make that point clear, that we made these recommendations with understanding that not all this recommendation applies to all the technologies. So let's go through the recommendations, okay? So the first recommendation, and I'm going to read maybe the high-level title, not the details, otherwise I won't be able to catch my flight at 5:30 to San Diego today. So I will just, but if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to answer. So I'll just go at a high level and describe some of these recommendations. One of the recommendations is that there are some technical enhancements to EAS that we would like to work on. And this became very interesting, because as we start discussing EAS more and more, a core group of our team, they start to build better working relationship and better understanding of the work that we have to do. And when we got to the end of the report, they said, oh, you know what, we really could use some more time to get a lot more involved in this activity. And the work that was done by that group was so well done that I asked the commission if we can extend the scope of the work slightly more, so that we allow the group, with all that knowledge that they have, they can provide that additional information. And the commissioner kindly granted for us to go ahead with this process. So we are planning to continue that discussion, and actually that goes beyond this original scope of the work, to add additional technical enhancement, so some recommendation on that. So we really would like to thank the commission for giving us that permission to do that work. Another recommendation is on improved geographical targeting on mobile and stationary devices. And as I said, some of these are already in works, but we want to make sure that we continue that work, so that if there's a polygon that you send, we have accurate to within that polygon, the alert is sent, etc. So this is one of those works that the group felt that it's very important to mention it. And as you may know, some of you may know that actually the 2018 report and order has some of these characteristics, including the last bullet, that we should do it within 0.1 mile of error. So that work is ongoing. Another recommendation is that the alerting devices should really take leverage of CAP protocol, Common Alert Protocol, and to make sure that this alerting system recipients provided the right information, and things like urgency, severity, uncertainty, and so forth, they are really conveyed all the way to the end. And the next recommendation is to increase the delivery speed of alert information to alert distribution. I mean, this is sometimes people think this is obvious, right? So, and it's important if you have an earthquake in San Diego, I want to know that as soon as possible. I don't want to wait, and Butch can tell that San Diego is not the only one in California, and everywhere else is important. If I touch that, it's an earthquake. So it's important that we make sure that the information is sent as soon as possible to the right group of people. So that's one of the recommendations, is that we always need to keep that in mind. The next recommendation is on multimedia aspects. It's becoming more and more interesting to not only send text messages, but potentially graphics, audio, video, and so forth. It sometimes convey more information. There are some technical challenges with it, so I don't want to say that these are all, we can do it tomorrow. But there's some objective. This is a recommendation that we need to consider in the coming years. The next recommendation is on making public alerting system resilient and redundant. Again, no-brainer, yeah, of course, but it's important to have that understanding that, in case of emergency, it's important that alerting systems do not fail us. And they are the redundant, resilient, again, goes back to my earthquake. If there's an earthquake and the alerting system goes down, then that's a problem. So, these aspects needs to be considered going forward. Next recommendation is on accessibility of alert information to all people. And this is important, and we have a lot more slides on this thing that, sometimes a lot of these devices are designed so that it's not as easy for hearing impaired or visually impaired to get that information. So we actually were very lucky to work with some of the groups on disability and that actually helped us with some of the recommendations coming here. So I have a couple of slides on that, and I really want to thank them for providing some of that information, and this was very useful. So the next slide talks about improving the accessibility of alert for hard of hearing and deaf people. And I think this came out with some of the discussion we had, and actually we had a council member who lead this activity. And it's, a lot of times that we have, I get the text messages on my phone about something that happened. Yes, that's great, but if I cannot hear it, what happens if there's no visual or something? So we want to be sensitive to needs of others that may have some disability aspect. So sometimes should there be a movie with a ASL, like American Sign Language, that shows the same content? So that we need to look into it a little bit further. And this is continuation of the same concept. Emergency alert notification and VIO and all those should be, and it's not just VIO or, like EAS and so forth, this should be accessible to everyone, including deaf and hard of hearing. And the next slide, the next recommendation talks about blind and visually impaired. Again, we often look at our phones and we say, okay, yeah, everyone's getting the alert. Well, some people may have visually impaired, maybe not be able to see the screen. So how do we go about that? And as I said, we had some, we were lucky that, and I really appreciate, we had some input from American with Disability Act, ADA, and some feedback from a few groups that helped us understand it better and provide some meaningful recommendation in our report so that we can improve on providing emergency alert to the group of people. And there's quite a bit of detailed recommendation that came out of that I'm not going through it, but I think it is important that we really take care of everyone that really needs emergency. The next one is on increased outreach to encourage the integration of public alert information across all consumer electronics. So yeah, I have my phone with me all the time, but some people may be having a different device with them. Maybe they're playing video games, they're playing something else. How do we make sure that those people also receive that alert? So that that's not just one means of disseminating information. People who are on other devices would potentially receive information as well. Continue research of improving public alerting system. It's obvious again, but we really believe that an organization should be established to oversee continuing improvement on it. And we have a number of organizations, and actually there are a number of groups. If you remember that table that I showed, I said that we just focus on the last 3 columns, but there are other groups that are focused on the first 2 columns. But I think overall it needs to be a holistic picture, that we need to work together so that we have an end-to-end perspective of alerting system. And it would be, this is becoming, we were just talking before the meeting about it, emergency alerting becoming more and more important for our communities. So having this, overall picture of one group is becoming more and more important. Real-time streaming and alert information, handling real-time stream. This is actually interesting. But now this is where we are starting to get into like a 5 to 10 years. One of the discussions that we had, which was pretty interesting, is that how do we make sure that, like if there is a earthquake, and it's, earthquakes are not stationary, they move. How do we make sure that as earthquake moves, we can provide that information quickly and immediately and show the people affected the direction, the path, etc. The same thing when there is a tornado, there is and weather alert. They are not stationary, they move very quickly. So we want to be able to show how this information, how the emergency is moving with time. There's some interesting research. Noah showed that this concept of, they call it facets, forecasting a continuum of environmental threats, and basically showed how the plume of the alerting system, like a weather case, actually moves, and how we can potentially reflect that to the user, so that if the user is not in the path now, but it will be eventually in the path, they know about it, so they don't go the wrong direction. So it's a pretty interesting discussion that there's some thoughts gone into that, and we want to encourage that discussion continuing. And along the same line, CAP is great. CAP is awesome, the Common Alerting Protocol. But there are some enhancements potentially can be done to CAP, and we would like to encourage some discussion going on how those potential enhancements could be done to CAP. And provide alert recipient with the ability to receive alert which are relevant to them. And these are some of the evolutionary stuff, and these are some of the stuff that already we are doing, but we want to emphasize that these are important, and we want to make sure that this happen to all the dissemination technologies, and we continue doing those. So one of them is to kind of allow folks to decide what kind of relevant information they want to receive. Some folks can say, well, I don't want to receive this type of, because I don't want to get alert every, okay, that's fine. That you have that option. And some of these we allow for wireless emergency alerting via. So giving the people the opportunity to decide what level of information they want to get, kind of important. Multimedia, I discussed that. There's already discussion going on how to provide multimedia, and sometimes they say a picture worth a lot of more 1,000 text. So text is good, it's efficient. That's the best right now. The way we do VIA is extremely efficient in our system, but should we consider multimedia? What type of multimedia we're talking about? What are the format of the multimedia? Is it just picture? Is it movie? Is it audio? All those needs to be discussed and understood so that we have this long-term plan of how we eventually want to provide those services. And provide feedback to alerting. I mean, this is kind of interesting discussion is that a lot of the alerting system is a one-way broadcasting to the user that the end user will receive it. But sometimes maybe it is interesting, and I know Francisco was in the previous CSRIC was very interested in similar subject, is that how do we kind of potentially provide some feedback that you know the user can provide to the authorities. Yeah, you know what, you just told me there's a thunderstorm here and the sky is blue, so why? and hopefully that would not be a case, but you know, some feedback back to the authorities in some examples may be useful. And consumer electronics, having it, as I said, like you have a, and I was going to give you an example of video games but I'm so old that I don't remember the name of, but you know, those video games that now kids have that they play with it, not phones, but the devices. You know, should they be able to receive if they have a way to communicate, receive communication? Yes, potentially. If they're playing video games, if there is a earthquake coming and we have an advanced early earthquake warning system, maybe they should receive that information as well. So that concludes the recommendations that we had, but I do want to provide a couple of updates. One is that after the report was disseminated, sent to all the council members, we received some comments and we made a few changes. So I want to highlight some of those changes. They are nothing major, but I think it's important to show those changes. In objective, we added a sentence basically said this report is not intended to make any recommendation to adopt or advocate for any particular technology. It's kind of obvious to most of us, but some members, they said, we really would like to highlight that. That's fine. Then on section 7.2.5 and 8, there was some discussion, as I mentioned, that we want to have diversity in providing alerting information, but there were some examples of some specific technologies, and the group felt that maybe that's not necessary to have it, and we want to just make it more generic, so we removed those examples. And finally, in section 8, at the beginning, where there was a recommendation, there was a suggestion to add, I read the whole sentence, the following recommendations should be applied to the extent feasible and added, and where they improve the content and or delivery of alert information for consumer. Again, I think it's pretty obvious, but the folks thought, the working group thought that it's important to highlight that. All right, so what's the status? So we have completed our first report, thanks to hard work. And I'm not, you know, there was it Labor Day? What was the last holiday? People were working during that holiday to get this report completed. And I really want to thank all the members of working group 2 who really spent a lot of time doing that. So we completed that report thanks to the great work of the team. Now we have a second report coming back. Actually, I would like to go back to that. Thank you. We have a second report coming back on security aspects of IPAWS, and just not about we're not going to change IPAWS, but how IPAWS sends information, so we need to be careful about that. But also security aspects of emergency alert. We heard it several times. Today, cybersecurity is becoming more and more important, and we echo that. So our second report is really going to be focused on that aspect, on the daisy chaining aspect and so forth. So we have already started that work, and people are really energized, and I hear a lot of great reports coming from that. So that is the subject of our second report. And there's some details on how to maybe add year and things like that. So, but that's the second report that will be coming back. So our schedule, right now, so we started bi-weekly, then towards the end we went to weekly, kind of like summer comes. So I said, okay, 1 month of bi-weekly, but I have a feeling we're going to go back to weekly meetings again. But we have a weekly and bi-weekly meeting. And so June 2018, we completed our second report. And this is a great news to our team. The next report is due for the December meeting of 2018 of the CSRIC. That doesn't mean that we have to finish by December. It's probably going to be sometime in November, but at least I think I told the team that it's going to be needs to be done by September. So I think there's maybe a relief coming out. And Susan, as I was telling her, this was like a Christmas and a birthday and all those gifts together combined. So I think the group really appreciates that. So the next report is due December of 2018, along with the update that we have to also provide. And the last slide, or the next step, continue this discussion on the EAS and you know, the security aspects. That's the work that we are doing right now. We will continue to have these weekly or bi-weekly meetings, and we provide updates to the September and continue providing updates to the council. With that, let me see.
Yeah, so, wow, Farouk and Working Group 2 team, I think amazing amount of work that's gone in there and forethought there, just thinking through the art of the possible when it comes to emergency alerting. So before we move forward with a vote on recommending the report and recommendations within that report, I'd just like to open it up for questions in the room and on the phone. Okay. Dorothy, you look, yeah.
I just have a comment. I appreciate the inclusion of consumer electronics in your report. Given the Internet of Things, it doesn't come too soon. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments out there? I mean, I do have a question myself. You're talking about multimedia and things like that, and really text to audio applications and things like that on a consumer electronics are very commonplace now. Was that something that you folks considered?
Yeah, well, I mean, we didn't go too much details on that specific issues, only because there are actually discussion going on even at the FCC on how multimedia could play, for example, for WEA, wireless emergency alert. So we didn't go a lot of details, but we did feel that multimedia across all platforms, including consumer electronics, TVs, ATSC 3.0, ATSC 1.0, all those multimedia play an important role. So, given the, unfortunately, it's good news, bad news. We had discussion about it, but multimedia by itself, you can have a whole CSRIC group just to discuss that topic and come up with a full report on that. So we touched upon it, but we really didn't go too much details on it.
Okay, anything else out there? So fantastic, Farouk. So let's vote in the room on your Task 1 report and recommendations in that. So all those in favor say aye. Aye. And on the phone, please.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any objections out there? Okay, so that's also passed. So thank you very much, Farouk, for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up on our agenda today, we have a readout from Working Group 3. Unfortunately, Travis can't be with us today, so we have Drew, who is ably standing in for him.
Thank you, Brian. So can you hear me okay? Thank you. So Working Group 3, I'm just going to bottom line it right up front, is that we're on schedule to deliver on Task 2, which is the report on the best practices and recommendations to secure 5G networks. We're on schedule to deliver that at the September CSRIC. So there's really been no change in the objectives, so no change in the charter, as was previously reported. The deliverables, first deliverable, Task 1, was actually delivered in the March CSRIC, so I'm not going to talk about that either. So Task 2, which is the current working deliverable that we're driving towards, is currently underway. It's focused on the 5G network security. We've got a couple different areas that we're focusing in terms of evaluating the security risks, and that has to do with the Internet of Things, open source 5G software, SDN and FV, and supply chain risks. One of the areas that we're looking at supply chain risk across all of these is the threats, the risks associated with that, and then we're going to looking at recommendations on best practices and mitigation of these security risks. One of the other things we're also doing in this report is we're going to add in a section up front that kind of helps to dispel some of the misunderstandings about 5G. So we're providing some front matter that will be a 5G overview. So trying to overachieve. One of the challenges is that trying to stay on point with the broad set of topics that we do have to cover within this, but as a team we've continued to work together and come to, if there's issues about expanding scope, we talk about them, we try to make sure that we're continuing to get all the voices heard, incorporated, but also to stay on track, because we have a lot to do in a short time period. Task 3 is going to commence after we deliver the report in September, and that report will be due in March 2019, so I'm not really going to spend any time on that either. Members haven't changed. By the way, I'm trying to make sure that Farouk can get his flight, by the way, Jim.
Are you hungry or something?
No. I've got a bullet coming up I can talk for 15 minutes on if you like, Brian. So just a kind of a quick background on 5G. Travis has done a great job of presenting this a couple times, so I'm not going to delve into it. Ultimately, what it is, the big difference we're seeing with 5G is that in the industry, we're focused on security up front, and we're designing it in as we go. And I think that that's a dramatic shift from prior technology development that we've done as an industry, where we've tended to focus on developing the technology and then figuring the security in a little bit. And that reflects the dramatic change that we've seen in the environment that our networks have to operate in. And I think it is commendable that the industry is taking that proactive viewpoint, proactive step to make that happen. So we're basically learning from the past and applying those learnings to the future. So with status, as I indicated already, that we're working on target, on time. Travis has us on a weekly cadence, Taskmaster. We're basically running through these 5 different sections I've already highlighted. One of the things that we have found is that cybersecurity SMEs in 5G are difficult to find, and that's pretty straightforward to understand. If you think about 5G is still in standards, specifications, labs. It really is not a technology that's being deployed anywhere, so it's difficult for some of the researchers to really be able to pound against these devices and these capabilities. So what we're actually doing with these different areas, and you look at IoT, NFV, even open source, and even supply chain, these are things that have been around for quite some time that are being adopted and adapted and change and migrate into the 5G architecture. So we're looking at the lessons learned from other industries, and we're bringing a lot of that information in. So we may not have a 5G, well, we do have some 5G cybersecurity expertise, but the subject matter experts are few and far between. But what we do have is a lot of expertise across these areas regardless that we'll be able to migrate and apply to it. So that's really kind of the approach that we've been taking. And examples could be, you look at virtualization. It's in the IT environment for years. Same thing with application programming interfaces. The way that these IoT devices are going to connect, these have existed for years. So those learnings will be applied into this to help guide us as far as how it's going to be applied and leveraged in a software-oriented architecture of 5G. Weekly schedule. As already noted, we're on target for our working group 3 schedule. As already noted, we're on target for delivery on time. This kind of shows where our reports are going to be due in September, and as well as the other one in March, and what our targeted time frame is to deliver it to the FCC so it can be delivered to the CSRIC for review. Finally, detailed set of milestones that shows how we're going to get from where we are today to that final delivery. The focus here is by having interim steps, getting all of the content in as identifying the threats, identifying the mitigation, and then from that we will work together as a working group to define and identify and document the best practices. So once again, we're on target, we're on time, we're on schedule. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. I think, given that 5G is that kind of ever-evolving landscape there, are there particular industry reports or the bodies of work that you're waiting for, that you need outside of what you're doing on NFV and SDN? Are there other things that you're waiting for?
I don't think we're waiting for anything at this stage. We can't wait because we have to deliver on time. What we are seeing is that originally the schedule, we would have been delivering this report at the end of September, in March. It got accelerated, and I understand that because the standards here are being accelerated. One of the things that would be, that there are going to be complementary efforts to this is what's coming out of 5G Americas, what's going to be coming out of GSM and some of the work that they're doing, as well as the 3GPP SA3 completes its specifications. That work's going to be helpful. But the reality is we have their initial drafts right now, and we're leveraging that technology and those reports. And I expect that what's going to happen with this is we're going to come out with this report, and then over the next 12, 24, 36 months, as 5G does enter the market, and as it does evolve from release 15 to release 16, and as the security specifications come out, we're probably going to be back here again.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ever-evolving thing. And any further questions in the room here? Farouk's looking very interested in a very academic situation. Or questions out there on the phone? I heard some beeps. I think people started their weekend early, Jeff. Yeah, I think so. But, yeah, thank you, Drew. Thank you. So really, thank you, Mary, Budge, Dorothy, for presenting on Working Group 1 and doing some fantastic work there, and great to see those recommendations going through, and also Farouk and your team of Imagineers, I guess we call them. Some fantastic work going on there as well in the alerting space, and really thoughtful, I think, in terms of what is necessarily the art of the possible for the future. And thank you, Drew, for filling in for Travis as well, who couldn't be here and sent his apologies. And it's also good to see Working Group 1 and 2 kind of extending their remit and extending what they want to do. And it's great to see that level of interest that's gone into that, and the level of effort that will continue to make our public safety systems much better and much secure as we move forward. So with that, I'll pass over to Jeff for his adjourning comments.
Thanks, Brian. And let me add my thanks to those of you that are here in the room and on the phone. But I also wanted to mention that, I mean, every time we have meetings like this and we get these recommendations, I'm reminded that there's a huge force multiplier that you all draw on to get them done. It's not just those of you here; it's those that are in the working groups that are, that are actually doing the work in the working groups. And so I want to thank those of you and those people as well. So the next time we'll be together is Friday, the 28th of September, and it's a nice day out, and it is a holiday weekend, and so I hope you all have a great holiday. If you travel to get here, have a safe trip home, and we'll see you in September.
Have a great 4th. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.